All right. Welcome to Meadowlarkers 58. We have our usual quorum here. Kate Fagan is here. Amin El Hassan is here in Brazil gear. Is that what
Brazil.
I see?
Yeah.
Old school Brazil, back
Old
in the
school
Umbro
Brazil gear.
days. Yep.
Got it. Got it.
1994.
Yes.
That doesn't signify Bolsonaro, I hope.
We have a special guest with us, David Maraniss, the great writer from the Washington Post. I'm not going to embarrass David because at Politics and Prose earlier this year, I came to an event for his new book, which is behind him, if you can see him, or I'll hold it up, Path Lit by Lightning, a phenomenal biography on the great Jim Thorpe. David was about to do an event, and the moderator, or the woman who was introducing him, went on and on about his ridiculously phenomenal accomplishments, and David sort of looked a little embarrassed, like he had some indigestion. They went on and on. Two-time Pulitzer winner, biographer of Vince Lombardi and Jim Thorpe and Roberto Clemente and Bill Clinton. And so I will not do that, but what I will say is behind me, if you can see over my shoulder, David is one of the few writers here who has his own shelf. And so yes, his shelf is there next to the Halberstam shelf. Business as usual today. 58 is a hard number for our honorary captains. I don't know if anyone else is going to participate in this, but I will offer, of course, the late, great Derek Thomas, linebacker for the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the great number 58s. Jonathan Papelbon, Red Sox closer. Also, we got a 58 there. You've got, then it really does devolve into linebackers, but before that you've got two-time Stanley Cup winner with the Pittsburgh Penguins, Chris Letang, also a good 58. and then we roll into Keena Turner, San Francisco 49ers, Wilbur Marshall from the Bears. Then you've got Carl Banks from the Giants. Kate Fagan should know this from the Lawrence Taylor days.
Okay, yep, I should have gotten that.
Then, of course, the great Jack Lambert, 58, Pittsburgh Steelers.
David, essentially every episode, and this is the 58th episode of Meadowlarkers, Howard just reels off many jersey numbers. He has a photographic memory, I suppose.
So these are all from his mind, not from Google.
He says these are all top of mind.
He says.
Yeah, there's still disbelief. Did you very quickly?
I could have gotten Lambert. That's the only one. So good for you.
I know this is a bit of a tangent. Did anybody see supposedly Steph Curry hit 5 consecutive full court shots?
No,
it is not. That is
that can't be real, right?
It's doctored. Yes.
Okay.
It is.
I think
it's doctored, but then he later said that he in real life he hit 2.
Okay.
Which is
similarly, Howard is also doctored as well.
I am so not doctored. I will say, however, that the video of Steph Curry hitting like 74 straight threes, I think, is real, isn't it?
That one's real, yes.
Which is ridiculous in by itself. David, we are here to talk to you about the story that has essentially taken a life of its own. You're part of the great Washington Post series called Blackout. It's a season-long, I think, or a year-long investigation into the NFL's hiring practices or lack of hiring practices when it comes to Black coaches and executives and such. And on the 23rd, you and Sally Jenkins came out with a bombshell. Headline was Jerry Jones helped transform the NFL, except when it comes to race. And of course, the news, of course, was also the photo of Jerry Jones's high school, not Central High School, but North Little Rock High School, of some white teens blocking the entrance of a half dozen Black students who were going to integrate the school, very similar to the famous Central High School photo with Ruby Bridges. And in that photo, there is a 14-year-old Jerry Jones with a crew cut and a month before his 15th birthday, taking it all in. And the ensuing, the story itself is great enough. The ensuing, the aftermath of the story being the whataboutisms with Kyrie Irving and the rest of all that sort of took on a life of its own. But we wanted to really just ask you about the story first.
Sure,
One, how long was it in the making? Where did you get the photo? Who tipped you off to all of this, or how did you decide that this was going to be something uncovered after 65 years?
It was in the making since June. That's when Sally and I got together. The Post contacted me and said, how would you like to do a piece on Jerry Jones? And I was thinking about it. And then they asked Sally if she'd like to join me. And that sealed the deal for me. I mean, I'd never worked with Sally before. It was fabulous to team up with her. So we started in June, but by August I was on book tour. So we worked in and out from June until it arrived in late November. The whole series had been going on all year, but I think the first piece wasn't written until the football season started. So it was a very serious project, which I was honored and delighted to be a part of. The photo came to us just by great work. I mean, Sally found it. We knew that Jerry Jones grew up in North Little Rock, Arkansas. And we knew that this was in the era of segregation and desegregation. And one day Sally was looking at an article that appeared in the New York Times on September 9th, 1957, and saw a guy in the background who might have been Jerry Jones. So she sent it to me and said, could this be him?
So Sally noticed the picture and saw him and said, that's Jerry Jones?
Yeah. And then we found the yearbooks, and it was pretty clearly him. And then I found actually an oral history that Jones did in 2010 for the University of Arkansas, David Pryor oral history there. And on page 70 or 75 or something, he alludes to that very event, sort of saying I was just curious. So that documented it. I mean, we were 95% sure that it was him, and then he acknowledged it in an oral history that had been buried in plain sight that nobody had ever looked at before.
Wow.
And so, that took us to North Little Rock, where we did much of our first research and then spread it out to the whole story. But as soon as we found that, we knew that it would be sort of an explosion, B, that we weren't going to bury it on, in the 35th paragraph, but C, that the story had so much more depth to it than that it would inevitably be reduced to that one photograph, and there was really nothing we could do about that. We just had to write our story the best we could.
And can you take us back to when you and Sally were discussing the photo and how you could try to connect it to the series that this is all a part of, which is
Right.
coaching in the NFL and the hiring practices and the dearth of Black coaches? What was the goal at the outset of, like, you're taking this photo from, doing the math, 50, 60 years ago, and trying to fill in the gaps about how that foundational piece launches us forward to understand Jerry Jones today and who his
Sure.
Cowboys have been without hiring a Black coach in his ownership history?
Yeah. It really wasn't that complicated, although there are a lot of nuances to it. But, my whole philosophy I'm a biographer, and my whole sort of the way I look at biography is that the best way to understand someone is to understand the forces that shape them. And so in that sense, North Little Rock, his family, the culture of that era shaped him. And he sort of, his experience wasn't exactly like the other 31 owners, or 30, not counting the Packers. But it was emblematic in that sort of, most of them are in their, a large majority of them are in their 70s, and they sort of came out of that period, whether they were Southerners or not. So, basically, that was the key, a defining moment of his youth, which was part of what we were doing. And we also, we understood from the beginning that to use that picture, we had to get the interview with him. We weren't going to just, it wouldn't have been the same without it. And the interview deepened our feelings about the importance of that photo, because we offered him the opportunity to talk about it, which he sort of did. He was a little bit deflective about it. But the key was that it helped explain Jerry Jones, because he really didn't express any regrets about the way those six, the little North Little Rock six, were treated that day, or the whole issue of segregation and the mean-spiritedness of it. But he was just worried about whether his coach would get mad at him for being there that day. That was really his focus. And that sort of self-interest of Jerry Jones was very reflective of everything he's done in his career as the owner of the Cowboys.
David, how much of that is a defense mechanism versus he's genuinely just that self-centered and could not think of outside of those terms, whether as a 14-year-old or as an 80-year-old man?
I think it was just him. I honestly do. I mean, there's so many different parts of that story, which I think are as explosive as that photograph, which reveal that sort of the way he looks at everything through his own sort of selfish lens. Particularly that story of talking to the black coaches and administrators at the acceleration program, which we obviously get into separately. But I think it reflected that. He was, to tell you about that interview, it was the day where the Cowboys were right before the trade deadline. There were a group of, all of his people in another room right next door waiting for him, and yet he spent 2.5 hours with us. So he obviously had a lot that he felt defensive about and wanted to try to explain, and that's why he was there that long.
Well,
David,
go ahead, Kate.
You alluded there to the anecdote of the story he told in the accelerator program about Augusta
Right.
National. Will you share that anecdote with our listeners, some of whom probably have not
Sure.
read the Washington Post story? And the second part of that is did it seem as if others, or when you presented, or Sally, him with the idea that perhaps that anecdote also alluded to some privilege he had and couldn't necessarily be mapped onto other people's experiences? Did he seem to understand the failure of that anecdote?
Excellent questions. So the story is that he was trying to explain his attempts to help young African-American administrators, coaches, leaders. And so at an accelerator program, he told them the story of what it takes to push yourself to excel. And he told a story about his own life, where he was a 30-year-old trying to make his way in the oil business, needed the financial help of an oil baron, went to his office, saw that the guy had some golf paraphernalia, memorabilia in his office, and then came up with this idea. And he went to his old coach at the University of Arkansas, Frank Broyles, who was on the board of advisors or visitors or whatever at Augusta National, and said, will you help me? I want to impress this guy. I need some money from him. Can you get him to play golf at Augusta National? And so Broyles said yes. The guy went down, played 36 holes with Broyles, and then decided to give Jones the money. He's told Jones, you probably think I decided to do it because I played at Augusta National. Not really. I decided to do it because I thought anybody who had that creativity and gumption to arrange for that is someone I want to work with. So he's telling this to a group of young Black guys who are all thinking to themselves, fat chance that I could do anything like that. That, we can't even play at Augusta National during that period, or for most of the time, the history of that course. It was just so out of the realm of what they were facing and the obstacles they faced. that it actually served the exact opposite purpose that Jones thought he was giving it to us for. It just helped explain him and why there's so many problems in terms of African Americans in the National Football League leadership. The second part of that was, after he told his story, I said, exactly that. I said, well, Jerry, that's not going to go over well with these young black guys who can't even play there. And that was one of those times where we mentioned in the story that when it really came to the nub, to the racial reckoning, he deflected. So he never really dealt with that. He started telling another story. And that was true every time we got really close to forcing him to acknowledge something, he would turn away.
That's the thing that I picked up on. That's why I asked, is that his selfishness or is it a deflection? Because I feel like he's presented multiple opportunities to at least say, gosh, I never thought about it like that. Boy, that must have been terrible. And instead,
in other words, you gave him the opportunities to be sympathetic or empathetic about it, and he didn't take
or contrite, and there's never contrition. It's just, oh, hey, look at this shiny ball over here. And
yeah, well, there's one point, later in the interview where, out of context, he says, I wish I had done more. I wish I had gotten up in the bus and not made the black kids sit in the back of the bus. That was as close as he came. But when it came to actual events involving him, total deflection.
Or even, but even that as an example is emblematic, right? When you say, I wish I had done more as a 14-year-old getting up off a bus, not as an 80-year-old billionaire who's the most powerful man in the sport.
Right now, you can still do any number of things.
You could do way more than you could have done getting up at the back of the bus.
There's virtually nothing you could have done as a 14-year-old, but plenty you could have done from that time after.
Absolutely so.
It's really interesting. When I first read the story, I was interested in it because obviously I'll read anything with David's byline in it. And I was, and my initial reaction was, I don't really have time for this today. I was sort of like, well, I'm not in the mood for this. I'm really not in the mood for, for white people doing white people things in 1957. And then I, said, okay, it's Thanksgiving. I'll read the story. So then I read them. I read it. And the thing that hit me, David, one of the very first things that hit me was, why do white people always need the smoking gun when there's a smoking gun? I thought it was a fascinating story. I loved the story. I thought it was great journalism. But the reaction, and of course, when we do these things, we don't have control over the reaction, right? Once you write it, it goes out into the world and then it belongs to everybody else. Yes. And so I was fascinated by the reaction to the story, where people were talking about, oh, well, did you see that picture? And Jerry Jones was there and he didn't do anything. And I was thinking, it reminded me of Tom Yawkey. Immediately I started thinking back about the owner of the Boston Red Sox, who for the great, the last quarter of his life, which is sort of the post, civil rights movement and then post-civil rights movement. And then, of course, in death, was Tom Yawkey a racist? Was Tom Yawkey not a racist? And we spend all this time with the Boston Red Sox about whether or not this man, what he was in his belief system. And what I loved about the story was, this is a jumping off point, or should have been a jumping off point, to explain what he's been. His monument is on the field. His monument, if you really want the answers, it's not the photo. It's what he's done as a billionaire and what he's done in terms of his hiring. And that's really, the reason why it's part of this series. And that's also sort of the illuminating piece when I, finally finished reading the entire story. I read it twice and came through to the same conclusion, which was, you don't want to hire. There are certain people that work for you, and there are certain people you hire to work with. Mm-hmm. And it seemed very clear to me. And, I've met Jerry Jones and interviewed Jerry Jones several times. And, I love the descriptions that you have of him, that, because he is incredibly genial, and he's really, he likes to be interviewed. He likes to talk. He likes to sit down. He's not hostile at all. You can see when he gets uncomfortable with different topics and he changes the subject. But generally speaking, Jerry Jones is, if you can get an interview with Jerry Jones, he'll sit down and talk with you, and he may even offer you some scotch, right?
I don't drink, but yes.
Right. And, but that will be your choice, not his, because he absolutely drinks.
Right.
And so what I thought was interesting about it was what you really did in the story was illuminate how the Dallas Cowboys have not hired a black coach for their history and during his tenure as well. That to me was the news.
Oh yeah, his incredible comment. It's not the X's and O's or the Jerry's and Joe's. It's who you knows.
It's who you know. And you've got that you've got that section in there where he talks about how he hired Jimmy Johnson and how he hired Barry Switzer and how he wanted to hire Denny Green. And he's essentially laying out how the world works.
Yes, he is. Yeah, I agree. And that's what the story was about. Why we started with the photograph and knowing that that would be the way that it would be reduced to that in the conversation afterwards. It would have been, even if it was in the 35th paragraph. I mean, I remember, this is a different issue entirely, but I remember in 1984, the Post ran a story about Jesse Jackson. And literally in the 34th paragraph, he called New York Hymietown, right?
Might as well have been the first sentence.
And that was all it was. I mean, that was the whole story, right? But it was in the 34th paragraph. This would have been the same thing. So we decided that the only honest way to deal with it is to deal with it right away. And we thought we did it in a way that served the context of the larger story. But
I actually thought the photo belonged where it was. Absolutely. If you had buried the photograph, I think it would have been worse.
Exactly. I agree. That's why we decided to do it that way. But the middle part of the story is the real meat of explaining why Jerry Jones, as the Cowboys owner, does what he does and why the record is so paltry on African Americans.
He says in it, Jerry Jones says in it, that he never thought the Rooney Rule would ever affect hiring practices because, as we just laid out, that's not how hires are made, and then, you went through and he went through in the article the ways in which he has hired coaches, alluding to how we all know things are done. But the thing, the nuance in between that is if Jerry Jones knew the Rooney Rule wasn't going to address actual hiring inequities, but he cared about this issue, then obviously you lay it out in the entire story, but what was your sense about shifting the Rooney Rule into some semblance of an actual plan that could actually affect this issue, whether or not that's something that Jerry Jones has ever even attempted to convey to his other 30, like you said, 30 owners in the NFL? Why is the Rooney Rule the way it is if it's not actually applicable to how hiring practices work?
Well, as we explained in the piece, Jerry Jones doesn't really care about that issue at all. He cares about making money. So that wasn't the secondary emphasis of him or the tertiary. I mean, it was way down the list. He wouldn't talk about it at owners' meeting. It was not something that he cared about. He cared about stadiums and endorsements and money, basically. And he acknowledges that. And he also acknowledged, I thought in a lot of ways, this story got closer to the truth of how the NFL operates than most stories. He acknowledged that the Rooney Rule was not something that anybody cared about, who makes the real decisions, that it was who you know, which is obvious from the regurgitation of these same mediocre coaches, generation after generation. But he also said that the only reason he's interested in, the term he used was diversity, which is a little bit nebulous, at all, was because of capitalism, that it was, that it was a diverse group of people who were going to the games and paying the money for it, and he had to deal with that. So that's his, Sally and I were talking the other day about this, to someone, and And she said, and I love Sally, and I rarely disagree with her. We had a seamless working relationship for this. But she said it'll only change when hearts and minds change. And I don't quite go there. I think it'll change because of money. If it changes at all, if you have a billionaire
right.
black owner, it'll change, right? Or more than one, or if they see that that's the only way they can operate. So
yeah, things don't change from hearts and minds. They change through force.
Yeah, I think so.
And they change through self-interest. For example, I remember we were talking about during the Me Too era, I think, Kate, I don't think you and I had talked about, maybe you did on one of the earlier shows, we were talking about how when you walk through a newsroom today or an office, it's not like all the guys in there are suddenly evolved. They just know we can't talk about things like that here now anymore, right? I mean, it's not that when you walk in, I mean, clearly things change over time, but there's incentive to no longer act a certain way or to speak a certain way or to hire a certain way. And it's in your best interest whether it's going to make you money or whether it's going to keep you employed. In Jerry Jones's case, it's whether or not it's going to make him money. I mean, go ahead.
But isn't this, it's very myopic, right? Like the idea that the reason why we do things is because I don't want to get in trouble, or
isn't it?
In the case of Jerry Jones, the reason why I'll do these things is because my paying customers would love the optics of us doing this, and that's going to appeal to us.
Of course, that's myopic, but that doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, human nature you have to take into account. That is myopic.
Right. I mean, let me ask you a quick question.
I mean, that's not the way I would want it to be. I mean, but I'm just trying to be realistic about it.
I mean, is jail a deterrent for you?
Yes, sure.
No, I mean, seriously.
It's not an incentive for sure. Yeah, it's a deterrent.
Is it a deterrent?
Yes, I won't speed because I don't want to get pulled over and, perhaps get criminal speeding and get sentenced to 30 days in jail. Yes.
How it works.
All right. I mean, I'm not, I guess it's frustrating that even as Jerry Jones understands he must do the right thing, he still doesn't understand why. He still doesn't get, it's not even about fairness. It's about, this is better business. You get a better product.
Is it better business?
Well, he thinks, I mean, it's a debatable question in Texas, actually. And, I was regretting after we did the interview that I never brought that up. We had, a billion questions to ask, and we had a lot of time, but didn't get to everything. But I was curious, what effect the culture of Texas has on his hiring process.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have heard the answer for that.
When I read that, go ahead, Kate.
Yeah. Well, what I found revealing too, and it sounds like, Howard, you've interviewed Jerry Jones a lot, so maybe you already knew this about him, is he gave you 2.5 hours, David. So, you might say, oh, he cares about this issue, but obviously it feels like he cares about his reputation when it comes to this issue. But did it surprise you at all, David, if you didn't know Jerry super well, maybe you did, how much PR, his reputation, that people see him in a certain light, that is less important to some owners than it seems to be to Jerry Jones?
Not much surprised me, Kate, for a couple of reasons. One is the interview was the last one we did. Well, there was one out. We interviewed Will McClay the next day, but that was basically the last of it. So I'd spent months studying him and reading about him and interviewing people about him. A lot of really brilliant people talked to us, some not for attribution, but we got a very deep understanding of him before we went into that room. The other reason nothing surprised me is because I had spent years of my life covering Bill Clinton and writing about a biography of him. He's another Arkansas BSer, so I had a very good sort of feel for what Jerry Jones was like from my study of Bill Clinton.
David, let me ask you a question to that point. In your research, how much existing literature, interviews, features, deep dives on the history of Jerry Jones did you find? Because as I'm reading this, I realize this guy's the most powerful owner in perhaps in all of American professional sports. He's very camera friendly, very, as you guys have just detailed, he's very open and accessible to media. And yet this is the first time I think I can remember reading something as detailed and as deep diving into his background. And I was wondering, is that my ignorance and there's other things that have existed out there that just haven't come across me, or was this the first?
Well, there have been a few others. There's a chapter in Mark Leibovich's book where he hangs out with Jerry Jones and actually gets drunk with him, which I was determined not to do. But it was Leibovich's style, which that's all I have to say. Van Atta did a piece, I think, for ESPN the magazine. Is that right, Howard?
Yep.
Which was very long and very detailed.
Also contained a lot of Johnny Walker Blue.
It did. And in neither case did they really go back to North Little Rock. I mean, Sally and I went there. That's my motto, go to these places.
Yeah,
so
that is the beauty of what David does. And I think you and I were talking about this in DC about the importance of going to the place. And I think when you were talking about going to Pennsylvania for Jim Thorpe and going to Carlisle and being on the ground, you get something that you're not going to get if you don't go there. And no matter how much you read and how much you may understand, there is a certain feeling that you get being on the ground.
And I just want to be clear real quick.
Yeah.
Forget about the photo. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the photo is explosive and huge. Forget about the photo. Just like you said, just the background, how he grew up, what his father's life was like,
Right.
what his family life was. I've never even heard kind of a glossed over, polished up version of like good old Americana, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps about any of this.
Well, here's something about that. I mean, most of the stories about Jones will say that his father was a grocer. He did run a grocery, but he also became a millionaire selling life insurance and had the biggest exotic animal park in the country in the Ozark Mountains. It was a complete character. And, you understand so much about Jerry Jones from studying his father. And then I found that his father had run for state legislature on a states' rights ticket. And then Sally found, she's amazing. She kept saying, I just want to find out who belonged to the Capital Citizens Council. And she found an old tape, teletype tape type of thing of the roster of the Citizens Council in 1957. And there was Joe Jones, who was Jerry Jones's grandfather. So we had both the father and the grandfather, and basically it established sort of the culture of the Jones family, leading through Jerry on the schoolhouse steps, through going there and searching through the archives, interviewing people, finding oral histories. All of that was because we went there.
Yeah, which is precisely my point in terms of none of this is shocking. It's revealing, it's important, but this is how it works. And I think that if you go and look at if you're in Arkansas at that time and you're a major business person, you would be the outcast if you weren't in those groups, if you didn't work along those lines or have that be part of your worldview. And I think that was one of the things about the series all year that I've really sort of enjoyed, is that there are essentially four legs to every table in sports, like in terms of the most powerful owners. And David, you know all this because you did Lombardi, right? The four legs of the table in the NFL these days, especially in the modern NFL now: Patriots, Cowboys, Steelers, Giants. You don't add the Packers because they don't have an owner. But in terms of the, Mara, Rooney, Kraft, Jones.
Right, that's it. Yeah.
Right. And of those four, only the Steelers have hired a black coach.
Yep.
If you look at the four legs of Major League Baseball, Red Sox, Yankees, Cardinals, Dodgers, only the Dodgers have hired a black coach. So when we talk about it being good for business, or don't they realize it's good for business, they know what their business is. And it reminds me as well as when you go back to, there are plenty of industries whose workforces are dominated by people of color, but their leadership isn't. Mm-hmm. And we treat the NFL and we treat professional sports differently because of the enormous salaries. But what they'll give you is a lot of money, but you're not breaking into that power circle. And these two things are really different. And I appreciate the journalism, and I really do. But it always bothers me when we act surprised that a racist country acts racist.
I understand that, Howard. I'd like to add this to it. It's your complete right to be cynical about that, but you can't write out of a point of cynicism. You have to write out of a point of skepticism. And I think there's a difference. So even though, of course, you can say, and it's completely true, that this doesn't surprise you, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be exposed and written.
No. And I don't mean written about, I mean read about.
Yes,
written about, absolutely not.
Yes,
but as a reader,
yes.
and this is what I mean about the reaction. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm 100% agreed. When you're writing, you can't write from that position because you're not doing your subject justice at all.
Right.
But when we're following the reaction, when you saw Jay Williams on ESPN saying, "I want Jerry Jones to denounce racism," and you're looking at this, and I'm thinking, have we not been paying attention to how this, to why there's a Rooney Rule in the first place? And then you saw the LeBron reaction. Why are you asking me about Kyrie, but you've never asked me about Jerry Jones? And I've just been stunned by that reaction, by like the things that are completely out of your control, but the way that the story has sort of reverberated into the culture the last few weeks.
Well, how about the Stephen A. Smith reaction?
Oh, yeah. And then the Stephen A. Smith reaction. Amin is rolling his eyes. What are your thoughts on that?
I try to not pay attention to any of it, honestly, Howard.
Well, but isn't it interesting for you though? Because as the writer, you are doing the job, and in doing the job, you've unleashed the reaction, right? So this is sort of
Sure.
It's not your fight, but it is sort of the interesting thing that comes from it.
I agree, and maybe that's where you're expressing your I've gone through this too many times with politicians, where when I wrote about Bill Clinton, you write a 485-page book and spend 3 years of your life doing it, and it gets reduced to one story about his sex life, So anyway, I don't look at the comments in the Washington Post after I've written a story. I unavoidably heard some of the reactions, although I haven't actually seen the video of LeBron or Jay Williams or Stephen A. Smith. I doubt if any of the three of them actually read the story, right?
No, I think they were reacting to the photo more than anything else. Which is,
of course, yeah.
And if we, just a quick, if we can go, when I first read the story and saw the photo, my first reaction was, I was shocked that there was still a piece of like an artifact that you could uncover in 2022 about such public a figure as Jerry Jones. I mean, in a world where, people will comb through, 100,000 tweets to find the one that they're going to publicize. Exactly. I was just shocked that photo, if it was in a New York Times article, like you're saying, that's where Sally found it, had not been made public before. The question for that, David, is, in your long history of writing biographies and reporting, are there other stumbling upon moments like that one that rank up there, where you're like, wow, I have this thing and it definitely is going to help anchor the story I'm writing, or it's this nugget that I can't believe no one else has ever found? Where does it rank on the list? And like, are there some other ones that you can think of?
Yeah, well, there's probably been one in every book I've written. For the Obama book, in his memoir, he writes this one page where he says, I was in love in New York once, and it was with a white woman. And every political journalist in the world was trying to find her for several years, and I found her. It took me 3 years, and she was in Australia. But once I found her, she gave me her diary that she kept during that period when she was dating Obama, which was actually
wait, but how did she wait, can you just stay there?
Yeah.
Did you ask for it? Did she volunteer it?
Kate,
how
this is how it happened, Kate. She was kind of new agey, and new agey women tend to like me because I'm kind of soft in a way. So she immediately sort of went into that. And then she started reading about me, and she read an interview I'd done where I talked about how important contemporary documents were. And she said, that was when I was writing about Vietnam. I talked about that, finding contemporary documents. And she said, that's very interesting. By the way, I kept a diary.
Would you like it?
Exactly.
Said, can I see it?
Yeah.
She was in Australia and you were in the States. Did she give you the actual diary? Or did she just send you pages?
She photocopied it.
No, okay. I was going to say she's handing over the actual document.
No, pretty close.
Wow.
You
Okay.
hold on to the thing for 30 plus years?
Yeah.
I knew he was going to be something.
And then for my Clementi book, Kate, the key to the end of the book is the tragic plane crash. And I kept trying to find out I knew that there'd be a lawsuit for any plane crash like that. So in Puerto Rico, at the courts there, they didn't have the records. They were missing. It was appealed to the Court of Appeals in Boston, but they just had sort of technical appeals. They didn't have anything really. Finally, I found a lawyer who had worked for the Federal Aviation Administration then. And actually his office was 3 blocks away from the Washington Post. I walk in, I start interviewing about it. And after 3 hours, he says, okay, you're the guy. And he took me over to his closet, and he had 3 boxes full of all of the real internal records of why that plane crashed, which had never really been exposed before. So yeah, I mean, the Jerry Jones thing falls into those categories.
You should write a book on JFK, because I feel like then we'll finally have the answer.
No, this is great. And the reason why this is great is because I was telling David, and I don't think he wanted to hear it, but I said, there's always a chapter in a Maraniss book that makes you think I'm in the wrong business. And the chapter, the Clemente chapter, the TikTok blow by blow of that plane crash and how that happened. I was reading that when that book came out, 2005? When did that book come out? Yeah.
2005, yeah.
And Jaw was on them. I was like, where did this come from? I've never read any of this. Where did this TikTok come from? And it was absolutely brilliant. And this is the stuff that you need. It really is. It's one of the great differences, because you're trying to write a narrative. And how do you write a narrative without the day-to-day detail? You've got to find that somewhere, or you're saying and not showing, as they tell us not to do in class. And David, one of the other things too that I, as we were going back and forth on this, is the actual point of what you were working on. To me, you try to make sure it doesn't get swallowed up by the cult of personality. And obviously, when you've got Jerry Jones involved, it's going to get swallowed up by the cult of personality. But the point is, it's an incredibly important story as part of this series that the Post is doing. These types of stories explain how things are. And I don't want to sound cynical about it. And I don't believe I am. I'm just saying that there are points where you say, let's not lose sight of the big picture here. And the big picture here, and we're going to do this again in January, Black Monday, the minute the season ends, and we're going to see which coaches get fired and which ones get hired. I'm going to point to stories like this that explain the minds of the people in that room. And of those 30 owners who are making these hires, stories like this explain, and if you're Robert Kraft, this thing belongs to them, and they hire who they want to hire. And the rest of it, and to Kate, I was thinking when you were saying about Jerry Jones being very image conscious, I don't think he's image conscious in terms of making sure people think he's a good human. I think he is very much conscious in terms of, here's why I'm here, and I am a businessman. And he doesn't hide that. He doesn't go out of his way to make it sound like he is this great civil rights champion. He explains why he does the things he does, because he is totally buttressed and comforted by the power he's got. He knows his place in this game.
Yeah.
absolutely right. And he said that in 100 different ways in the interview with us, that's really what he was all about.
Yeah. And when I was saying, David, when I was saying, go ahead. I mean, I was going to say, when I was saying that I was, you know, a little bit of an eye roll, it wasn't at the material.
No,
it was at this phenomenon that we have, that we need the photo to explain what he has been explaining to us every coaching cycle of his ownership.
Right. But sometimes that's what it takes.
Yeah, 100%.
It's funny to that point, Howard. I remember my friend saying, "Oh, can you believe it?" I said, "Can I believe that an 80-year-old man from Arkansas who is an oil baron and owns an NFL team may not be on the right side of racial history?" Yes, I can believe it. Imagine that. I did want to ask you about Will McClay, who is the VP of football ops there, personnel, and longtime employee of Jerry Jones, and is Black. And there are two things that came to mind. First of all was Jerry Jones explaining why he gave Will a shot, because he showed up to his grandkid's graduation or something like that. And somehow that is evidence of the gumption that leads to a great career.
Right.
But the other thing was, as Will, I guess, has become his de facto sounding board for race issues, in the last couple of years, what kind of influence has McClay had back on Jerry in terms of those hiring practices? In other words, I don't want to say how much can we hold Will McClay responsible, but how much sway does he have in that avenue in order to bring about that change that hasn't happened?
I don't think he has any sway in terms of hiring the head coach. I think that's all up to Jerry.
In terms of changing that mentality, though,
well, I mean, that's not easy to do. I think he's had some effect. I had not known him before we interviewed him. I liked him quite a bit, actually. And he's in a pretty sensitive position, working for Jerry Jones. I think he's doing as much as he can and trying to stay there. And he when I ask him, do you want to be general manager? I mean, he does, and that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, his son will take over. Stephen Jones will take over before that ever happens.
Yeah. I thought when I was reading this story, I think it both illuminated the series at hand, why there aren't very many Black coaches in the NFL, but it also did this other thing, which I thought explained to me in a different way why the Cowboys haven't been that successful in the last 25 years. Because I was like, well, if this guy's hiring somebody because he showed up to his grandkids, graduation, I'm not saying that Will isn't deserving of a spot. And if Jerry Jones has a blind spot to the anecdotes he's telling, and if he truly believes that he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and he's only going to surround himself with people who reflect that same kind of his vision of what being industrious is, well, then he has not quote unquote diversified his hiring practice. And by that, I don't mean the color of your skin or your gender. I just mean the different ways people succeed in life that might not look like how you succeeded. So there is no question in there, David, other than like that. It was very illuminating. Like, this is why the Cowboys haven't been good. This is a piece of it. That's what I meant.
That's what I meant when I said bad for business. I mean, I get they make a lot of money, but it's like they're not good.
Anything. Spikes. That's right. Anything that comes before winning is losing. Are they actually trying to win? Are you trying to go and find the best people who have the most sort of innovative thoughts to help you win games and all of that? I was talking to Bomani about that earlier today about Deion Sanders, which we may talk about next week.
Yes, we should.
Has anybody yet asked that man about what is your actual offensive and defensive football philosophy? I mean, like, what are your X's and O's in terms of winning games? But that's an aside. Last thing for you, David. I know we're going to
first of all, Kate, I think you got it exactly right. I appreciate what you said, and I think that's exactly right. That it had those two levels to it.
Yeah.
And it explains so much about him.
Well, and that's what you did in the Lombardi book, which is to recognize that more than anything else, Vince Lombardi wanted to know if you could play football. I mean, it was his way to play football, but could you play the game? And if you could play the game, he was going to give you a shot to play the game. And that did two things. One, it got him really great players. But the other thing it did is it made those players during that time believe that they were, I'm going to work for this man. I'm going to play for him. I'm going to run through a wall for him because he's one of the only people I've met in my life at this time who is going to judge me on my ability to do this. And that's what we always say sports is supposed to be about.
There's a cowboy connection to that too, which is Herb Adderley played for Vince Lombardi and for Tom Landry.
And for Landry, yeah.
And he loved Lombardi and could not stand Landry for those very reasons.
Yeah,
So,
David, we have had you on long, but Amin has another question for you. If you can, we'll go one more.
Last one for me. As I've said earlier, it's incredibly detailed and well researched. How much resistance did you encounter in talking to any of these sources or even Jerry himself?
It took us several months to get the interview with Jerry, but we got it, and that says something about him. However you want to interpret it. Robert Kraft wouldn't talk to the Post. None of the other owners would. Even Mark Murphy, who I know, wouldn't talk to me for this article. Not even on background, but we got everybody else we needed. Some not for attribution, some for attribution. No other resistance. Jones didn't try to stop us from interviewing other people, and he didn't. I mean, you can imagine if you tried to do a piece like that about Danny Snyder, you couldn't do it. I mean, everybody around him would have been scared and told not to talk. And Jones did not tell anybody not to talk. And Emmett Smith and Will McClay both, were willing to talk about Jones's blind spots. So I give him that credit too, for whatever that's worth. But
excellent.
Yeah.
Kate?
No, that's it.
Good.
David, thanks for joining us, and thanks
Thank
for
you so much, David.
the illuminating piece.
Sure, it's great to meet you too. Thank you, Howard.
This has been great. We are concluding Meadowlarkers 58 with the great David Maraniss, and read his piece in the Post, the November 23rd piece on Jerry Jones. And it is great stuff. David, we can't thank you enough. Next week, we've got Meadowlarkers 59. We don't know what we're going to talk about next week, but maybe it'll be Deion Sanders. Maybe we've already done that. Maybe we've let that go. And we will see you next week. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.